Nobody declared war that night. Nobody launched a missile. Nobody issued an ultimatum. What happened recently in the Strait of Hormuz was not disclosed in press briefings. It was not announced from a podium in Washington or Tehran. And yet, what took place in those 19 minutes and 40 seconds beneath the surface of one of the most contested waterways on the planet may have permanently changed the way naval warfare is understood, fought, and feared. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, not as a military technical exercise, but because what this operation reveals about Iran's strategy, China's involvement, and the limits of American naval dominance is something that every person paying attention to global security needs to understand right now. Let's start with the geography, because it matters more than most people realize. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is not a lot of ocean. In strategic terms, it is essentially a bottleneck, a single choke point through which roughly 21% of the world's seaborne oil passes every day. Saudi crude, UAE exports, Qatari LNG, Iraqi petroleum, all of it moves through those 21 miles, which means whoever can threaten that corridor, credibly, persistently, at acceptable cost, holds leverage over the global economy in a way that very few geographic features allow. Iran has always known this. The United States has always known Iran knows it. And for 37 days before the night of May 19th, the U.S. Navy had been enforcing a blockade across that corridor that Tehran was running out of conventional options to break. By conventional options, I mean missiles, aircraft, surface vessels, fast boats. The kinds of threats the U.S. Navy has spent decades training to counter, and in this confrontation had already countered multiple times. Iran could not win a surface fight. It could not win an air fight. And it had drawn the correct conclusion that it needed a different category of weapon entirely. What it deployed that night was called Ghost Shoal by U.S. analysts after the battle, and what it represented was not just a new weapons system, it was a new philosophy of warfare. 63 autonomous underwater vehicles, each one roughly the size of a surfboard, each fitted with an AI-coordinated acoustic mesh network, a system where every unit communicates with every other unit in real time, so the swarm behaves not as 63 separate machines, but as one distributed decision system. Each unit carried a 4.2 kilogram shaped charge, precisely calibrated not to sink a ship, but to disable one, rupture a propulsion shaft, flood a ballast compartment, stop the vessel dead without killing the crew, because dead American sailors would have meant a war without sealing. Paralyzed American ships meant something more controllable, a 6-hour window in which the blockade gap could be exploited before the U.S. could recover and respond. The engineering behind Ghost Shoal did not come from an IRGC garage. The acoustic mesh network was developed under a dual-use marine research program at the Harbin Institute of Technology in cooperation with the IRGC's Underwater Warfare Division. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Harbin Institute of Technology. That is not an obscure institution. It is one of China's premier defense-adjacent research universities, consistently linked to PLA programs and listed by the Pentagon as an entity of concern for technology transfer to Chinese military applications. The technology transfer here did not go from China to the Chinese military. It went from a Chinese university to Iran. And then Iran turned it into 63 machines and put them on the seabed of the Strait of Hormuz. That connection between Beijing and Tehran is one of the most important facts to emerge from the May 19th operation, and I will return to it. The attack was not improvised. It was layered, coordinated, and sequenced with a precision that reflects months of planning and at least one significant intelligence operation on Iran's part. 47 minutes before the first Ghost Shoal unit began its approach, an NSA satellite intercepted a burst-compressed radio packet on a frequency band associated with PLA Navy experimental programs. The packet lasted 0.4 seconds. Analysts flagged it as anomalous. By the time it was processed and passed down the chain to 5th Fleet Command in Bahrain, 22 minutes had gone. Nobody connected it to the bulk carrier Dongfeng Xiang, flying a Panamanian flag of convenience that had been sitting at anchor 12 nautical miles east of the blockade line for 31 hours. Just far enough outside the intercept zone to look like a vessel with engine trouble. It was not waiting for a repair crew. At 0312 hours, the USS Gravely, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer holding Blockade Station 22 nautical miles southwest of Keshem Island, had a clean tactical picture. The radar was clear. The Link 16 data network was quiet. To every sensor on that ship, the strait was exactly what it appeared to be at that hour: dark, contested, and under control. The Ghost Shoal units had been on the seabed for hours, lying dormant in the silted bottom at 40 meters depth, waiting for an activation signal that never showed up in any pre-mission threat assessment. They were already inside the perimeter before anyone knew there was a perimeter to breach. The moment the sonar operator, Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb, registered 63 simultaneous microacoustic signatures moving in mathematically precise geometric formation at 4 knots, two things happened at once. Webb hit the general quarters alarm, and Iran activated Phase 2. Phase 2 was the electronic warfare element. 3 platforms disguised as commercial fishing trawlers positioned in a triangle around the blockade line that activated jamming systems derived from the Russian Krasuka-4 electronic warfare platform. These were not Iranian copies. They were Russian hardware, moved through Caspian Sea logistics routes in the weeks prior to the operation. In 1.3 seconds, those systems flooded every frequency band between 3 GHz and 18 GHz across the operational area. The SPY-1D radar on the Gravely did not go dark, it went blind. The screens filled with thousands of phantom tracks moving at random vectors. The Aegis combat system, designed to manage real-world threats, was overwhelmed by a wall of electronic noise it could not discriminate from reality. The Link 16 network went effectively dead. The Gravely was cut off from 5th Fleet Command, from the carrier Abraham Lincoln 60 nautical miles southeast, from the P-8A Poseidon aircraft conducting anti-submarine patrol over the Gulf of Oman. The IRGC had calculated this very specifically. The jamming window did not need to last long. It needed to last long enough for the Dongfeng Xiang to accelerate through the blockade gap, while the American ships were deaf, blind, and disorganized. 12 minutes. That was the estimate. 12 minutes to punch a hole through the most heavily enforced naval choke point on the planet. Here is what Iran did not calculate. Marcus Webb, operating in the narrowband passive acoustic domain, the one slice of the sensor environment the jamming systems had not targeted because it fell below their lower frequency threshold, isolated the 63 Ghost Shoal signatures using a 220 Hz tonal filter tuned to the electric motor signature of the AUV units. The IRGC had not masked that frequency. It was an oversight, possibly because the jamming threshold had been set based on weapon system specifications rather than the specific acoustic fingerprint of the AUVs themselves. Webb, working in what he later described as looking through a keyhole in a burning building, had the contact geometry. He had the approach vectors. He passed it to the captain. Commander Elise Nakamura made a decision that rewrote the countermeasures playbook for autonomous underwater threats. She ordered the AN/SLQ-25C Nixie torpedo countermeasures deployed simultaneously, not as decoys, which is what they are designed for, but as acoustic emitters, each broadcasting an exact replica of the Gravely's own shaft signature at 32 times normal amplitude. From the perspective of the Ghost Shoal mesh network, the same acoustic target it had been converging on was now suddenly broadcasting from 8 different directions at once. The swarm's consensus algorithm, which was designed to achieve distributed target acquisition, had never been tested against deliberate acoustic duplication of its own target signature. It began circling, recalculating, trying to resolve an ambiguity its programming did not anticipate. Nakamura bought the crew 90 seconds. She used those 90 seconds to deploy the Mark V CUAS pods, expendable underwater vehicles that descend to 40 meters and broadcast low-frequency pressure pulses capable of overwhelming the proximity sensors on munitions approaching final guidance lock. Against 63 coordinated units, they were not enough to stop the swarm entirely, but they prevented the 0.9-second physical clamping sequence that each unit needed to complete to attach its charge to the hull. At the same time, Nakamura was on a UHF handheld radio on 243 MHz, the aviation emergency guard frequency, the one band the Russian jamming system had deliberately avoided targeting because it is an internationally protected channel, and using it would have created a different kind of international incident. She was calling one of the P-8A Poseidon aircraft, call sign Raptor 1, which had already detected the jamming wall from above and understood the tactical picture before she finished her second sentence. Raptor 1 descended, deployed a line of DICASS sonobuoys above the Gravely's position, and began relaying real-time swarm formation data to the USS Vermont, a Virginia-class submarine running silent at 60 meters beneath the thermocline 4 nautical miles west, which had been there since the operation began, and which the IRGC jamming array could not reach at that depth. What happened next was brutal in its simplicity. The Vermont fired 3 Mark 46 torpedoes, not at any surface target, not at the AUVs themselves, but at precise coordinates around the Gravely's position, detonating them at 40-meter depth to generate hydroacoustic shockwaves moving outward at 1,500 meters per second. The calculated overpressure at each AUV's position was not enough to destroy the units. It was enough to flip the gyroscopic inertial navigation systems inside each one, corrupting their stored positional data and breaking the approach geometry the mesh network had been building for hours. 3 detonations: 03-1831, 03-1833, 03-1836. In the after-action analysis, 61 of the 63 Ghost Shoal units were confirmed neutralized. 1 attached its charge to the Gravely's sonar dome, but the trigger circuit had been flipped into a fault state by the 3rd pressure wave. The charge sat on the hull, inert. The 2nd unit lost battery power 18 meters from the hull. Its shaped charge is now on the seabed, 22 meters of water above it. The Gravely was intact. No sailor was killed, and at 03:21 hours, the Vermont brought itself to periscope depth and broadcast a single message on 243 megahertz in Farsi, using a synthesized voice pattern reconstructed from an IRGC VHF recording captured in a 2024 SIGINT operation. The message told the Dongfeng Xiang that IRGC Naval Command, Bandar Abbas Control, was ordering an immediate abort. The authentication code in the message was real. It had been extracted from that 0.4-second burst transmission the NSA satellite captured 47 minutes earlier. The transmission Fort Meade had logged as anomalous was not a routine status check. It was the pre-mission authentication broadcast, and the NSA had stolen it in real time. The Dongfeng Xiang went to emergency reverse. The captain had no reason not to believe the abort order was genuine. He did not know which IRGC unit was running the operation. He had been told only to transit when the window opened, and that IRGC would provide authentication on 243 megahertz if anything went wrong. The authentication code matched. He stopped the ship. At 03:26 hours, the USS Cole arrived at intercept range, having run at 30 knots from its station south of Hormuz Island since the moment the GQ alarm first reached Fifth Fleet via the P-8A relay. By 03:31 hours, the first U.S. Navy boarding party was on the Dongfeng Xiang's deck. In Hold 3, they found 41 crates marked as industrial ceramic components. Inside, Maktab 9 terminal guidance seekers, the active radar guidance system for Iran's Fateh 2 hypersonic glide vehicle. 11 more crates contain Krasuka-derived software processing units. In a sealed forward compartment, 3 Iranian engineers traveling on false Chinese passports. IRGC Aerospace Force officers. The operation was over. 19 minutes and 40 seconds from Webb's first sonar alert to the last AUV contact neutralized. No shots above the waterline. No American deaths. Now I need to tell you what this means, because the outcome, a U.S. tactical victory, a shipment seized, the blockade intact, is the easy part to understand. The implications are considerably harder to sit with. The first thing to understand is the cost calculus. The Ghost Shoal swarm, 63 AI-coordinated autonomous underwater vehicles capable of disabling a guided missile destroyer, cost less to build than a single Tomahawk cruise missile. That sentence deserves to be repeated in full because it describes something fundamental about where warfare is going. A weapon system that came within 18 meters of paralyzing an American naval blockade cost less to produce than one conventional standoff weapon. If Ghost Shoal had succeeded, the strategic and economic consequences would have been measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Oil prices spiking beyond $130 a barrel, the blockade broken, Iran's position in the confrontation transformed overnight. The weapon that nearly caused that outcome cost a fraction of a Tomahawk. The second thing to understand is what failed and why, and what comes next. Ghost Shoal failed because of 3 specific identifiable reasons. The 220 Hz motor tonal was not masked by the jamming system. The consensus algorithm had not been tested against deliberate acoustic duplication of its target, and the authentication code had been stolen in real time from a transmission that lasted less than half a second. Each of those failures is already, as you read this, being corrected by whoever is working on the next generation of the system. The 220 Hz signature can be masked. The consensus algorithm can be updated to account for acoustic duplication scenarios, and the authentication protocol can be changed so that no pre-transmission authentication code is ever reused. The engineers who built Ghost Shoal were in a debriefing room by the morning of May 20th, not an IRGC interrogation cell, but a room at Langley, because they were captured aboard the Dongfeng Xiang with false passports. What they know about the system's failure modes is now in American hands. What the people who sent them know about the system's failure modes is the more dangerous question. The third thing to understand is the China dimension. The PLA Navy issued a statement after the Dongfeng Xiang seizure calling it illegal interference with freedom of navigation. The Pentagon responded by releasing the serial numbers from the Maktab 9 seekers, which traced to a procurement order linked to a company on the U.S. entity list, meaning a company Beijing had already been put on notice about. China went quiet. Tehran said nothing. That silence is more telling than any statement either government could have issued. The Harbin Institute of Technology connection means this is not a case of rogue actors or deniable middlemen. The technology pipeline from Chinese defense-adjacent research to IRGC operational deployment was documented, traceable, and now publicly established by a U.S. military boarding operation. Beijing cannot claim ignorance, it can only claim distance, and the distance is shrinking. What is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz is not a bilateral confrontation between the United States and Iran. It has not been that for some time. Iran is the operational actor in the theater, but behind Iran sits a strategic relationship with Russia, which supplied the jamming hardware moved through Caspian logistics routes, and a technological relationship with China, which supplied the AI mesh architecture that made Ghost Shoal possible. That triangle is not incidental, it is structural, and it is operating in the most critical energy choke point on the planet. Consider what a successful Ghost Shoal operation would have achieved for all three actors. For Iran, a broken blockade and restored leverage. For Russia, a demonstration that its electronic warfare hardware can blind U.S. naval assets in a real-world contested environment, intelligence worth more than the cost of the hardware. For China, a proof of concept for AI-coordinated autonomous underwater warfare conducted at arm's length through a proxy in international waters with plausible deniability. None of those interests disappear because the May 19th operation failed. The fourth thing, and this is the one I find most difficult to dismiss, is the question of what else is on the seabed. The Ghost Shoal swarm that attacked the Gravely was not described by any U.S. official as the first deployment of such units in the strait. The after-action report referenced the seizure of the units that completed their approach runs. It documented the units neutralized by the Vermont's torpedo detonations. What it did not establish is how many prior deployments had occurred, how many units had been positioned on the seabed before the May 19th attack, and how many may still be there. The Gulf is not transparent. The thermal layers, salinity gradients, and sediment conditions that made the Gravely's passive sonar effective in that engagement are not uniform across the strait. There are sections where the acoustic environment is far more complex, where the conditions that allowed Webb to isolate the 220 Hz tonal signature do not exist. If units are pre-positioned in those sections, the detection challenge is fundamentally different. And here is the strategic logic that concerns me most. The May 19th attack did not need to succeed outright. It needed to prove the concept, identify the detection and countermeasure gaps, and demonstrate that autonomous underwater swarms are viable in contested choke point environments against the most sophisticated anti-submarine warfare assets in the world. On that measure, even a failed attack generates valuable intelligence for the engineers who built the system, for the governments who authorized it, and for every other naval power watching the exchange. The Gravely's crew performed exceptionally. Nakamura's decision to use the Nixie emitters as acoustic duplicators rather than decoys was not in any standing doctrine. Webb's isolation of the 220 Hz tonal while the tactical picture was exploding around him was the kind of rapid, specific decision that no automated system would have made faster. The Vermont's acoustic torpedo solution, coordinated through a P8A relay while operating below the jamming wall, was textbook multi-domain response under degraded communications. All of that is genuinely impressive. But the fact that those decisions needed to be made at all, in real time, by individual sailors, against a threat that arrived with no warning and no single identifiable attack signature, tells you something about where the capability threshold currently sits. The U.S. Navy defeated Ghost Shoal on May 19, 2026. The margin was not as wide as the outcome suggests. 37 days into the blockade, global oil prices had already reached $118 a barrel on the morning after the attack before settling back to $106 by afternoon trading. That single night, 19 minutes of engagement, not a single ship sunk, moved the price of oil by $12 a barrel in under 8 hours. The economic sensitivity of the strait to perceived operational threat is not theoretical. It is documented. Every market participant on Earth now knows that Iran has developed AI-coordinated autonomous underwater weapons capable of engaging U.S. naval assets. That knowledge does not disappear when the price settles. There is one more dimension of this operation that has received almost no public attention, and I think it deserves to be stated plainly. The targeting doctrine behind Ghost Shoal was specifically designed to avoid killing Americans, not because the IRGC has any humanitarian concern for U.S. sailors, but because killing Americans would have triggered a military response that Iran, even with Russian jamming hardware and Chinese AI architecture, cannot survive. The operational design, disable, don't destroy, paralyze, don't provoke, reflects a calculated understanding of escalation thresholds that is far more sophisticated than Iran's conventional military posture suggests. This was not a desperate gamble. It was a precise, graduated provocation designed to achieve a specific strategic result while staying below the threshold that would bring the full weight of U.S. military power into direct contact. That kind of calibrated aggression is, in some ways, harder to counter than open warfare. It occupies the space between confrontation and conflict. It forces a response without creating the political conditions for a decisive response, and it will be attempted again because it almost worked. There is also a question that nobody in Washington is asking loudly enough yet. What does the seizure of the Dongfeng Xiang mean for the shipping industry? The ship was flying a Panamanian flag of convenience. Its captain was a Chinese national under contract to an IRGC-linked company. The cargo was declared as industrial ceramics. Every one of those layers of legal and institutional cover is standard practice in sanctions evasion, and every maritime insurer, port authority, and cargo verification service in the world just received a very clear demonstration that none of those layers are reliable. The Panamanian flag registry, the shipping company contract structure, the cargo manifest, all of it proved meaningless against a determined state actor with a strategic objective and a willing captain. The implications for blockade enforcement extend well beyond the Strait of Hormuz. If a vessel flagged in Panama, crewed by a Chinese national, contracted through a shell company, can be used as a delivery vehicle for hypersonic guidance systems and electronic warfare hardware in an active U.S. naval interdiction zone, then the question of how the U.S. Navy discriminates between legitimate commercial traffic and adversary logistics runs at every blockade it has ever run or will ever run becomes considerably harder to answer. The Dongfeng Xiang was not invisible. It was hiding in plain sight, using the legal architecture of global shipping as camouflage. That architecture is not going to change because of one seizure. There are hundreds of vessels in the same category operating in contested maritime zones right now. That is not alarmism. It is a documented feature of how sanctions evasion has functioned for decades. What changed on May 19th is that one of those vessels was caught in the act, not during a routine port inspection, but during a live blockade operation that had just seen an AI-coordinated underwater swarm attack on a U.S. destroyer. The combination, the swarm below the surface, the ship above it, was the full operational picture. Ghost Shoal was not just a weapon, it was the distraction phase of a logistics operation. Understanding that sequence matters. The blockade held on May 19th. It has held since. But the questions that the Pentagon is not yet prepared to answer publicly are exactly the ones that matter most going forward. How many Ghost Shoal units remain on the seabed of the Gulf? How many were deployed before the units that attacked the Gravely? What happens the next time the motor tonal is masked, the authentication code is air-gapped, and the sonar operator looking at a swarm of micro-contacts has never encountered anything like it before? The war in the Strait of Hormuz did not end that night. It moved below the surface, below the waterline where cameras cannot reach, where satellites cannot resolve, where the normal vocabulary of military confrontation runs out. It moved into a domain where 63 machines costing less than a single cruise missile can hold the world's most critical energy corridor in a state of permanent, unresolvable threat. The next Ghost Shoal is already being built somewhere. The engineers know what went wrong. The geometry that failed will be corrected. The frequency the jamming wall missed will be covered. And when the swarm comes back, if it comes back, it will not be the same swarm that the USS Gravely's crew defeated in 19 minutes and 40 seconds. That is not speculation. That is how weapons development works. Every failure generates a next version, and the next version does not announce itself.